Philosophers Compass podcast. I'm your host, Meredith Alexander Kunz, and I really appreciate you joining me here for this episode where I have Eden Blazejak. He's a postdoctoral research fellow in the Department of Politics and International Relations at Adelaide University. His research specialty is the political thought of the Hellenistic philosophical schools, Stoicism, of course, and Epicureanism. So it'll be really interesting to hear from him about that as well, and its uptake and reception in early modern Europe. He's co-author of the book, Stoicism and the Western Political Tradition, from 2021. And I was introduced to him by Professor Lisa Hill, who was a previous guest on this podcast, who also shared about Stoicism, politics, and the Scottish Enlightenment, which I learned quite a lot there, and the Renaissance and Elizabeth I. So I'm very glad to be connected with Eden today. Welcome.
Pleasure to be here.
Excellent. So I wondered if you could share about how you first became interested in Stoicism and what did you like about it?
So my journey to Stoicism probably begins at least 15 years ago now. It was a pretty basic entry point. I was very interested in philosophy in general, and I'd picked up the book, The Consolations of Philosophy by Alain de Botton. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but that was a great bestseller back in the day, a real sort of intro point to philosophy. And the chapters of that book sort of tackle different philosophical traditions by focusing on a particular thinker. And so one of the chapters in there is on Stoicism, and particularly through the lens of Seneca. And so my entry to point to Stoicism was very much in that Senecan lens. I was very much just absorbed in that Senecan worldview, and I think it spoke to me temperamentally. Seneca, particularly the way sort of Alain de Botton presents him, is this kind of sour, pessimistic figure. And temperamentally, I think that just aligned perfectly with me. I think sort of Stoicism slotted into my life in that way. I just sort of was particularly drawn to the way that Seneca emphasizes the vicissitudes of fortune and how, you don't really have this control over your life like you think you do. So much of this is just fortune. And as sort of Seneca presents fortune, she's this kind of fickle figure. She's got the cornucopia in one hand and the sickle in the other. And with one hand she gives, with the other hand she takes away. And so Seneca's always, his message always is, that which fortune hasn't given you, she cannot take away. You need to focus on what's in your control and what is impossible for fortune to steal from you, because fortune can take away your friends, your family, your job, your career, your property, any of this. But your knowledge, your wisdom, your virtue, that's always yours. And that really sort of spoke to me. And so I think it aligned with my sort of inherent pessimism. And I was very drawn to that aspect of Stoicism. And that's sort of where I remained for a good few years until I came to Stoicism academically. And that's when I actually sort of went back and read the other thinkers, Epictetus, Marcus Aurelius, Cicero, all of the different, various fragments, and Digenes Laertius and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, my entry point was very much that sort of personal journey. And it wasn't until a few years later that I actually started to study it academically and got a very different perspective on Stoicism at that point when you start to incorporate all these other perspectives.
I think it's actually very cool to hear that Seneca was an entry point for you, because I haven't heard that very much. A lot of people say Marcus Aurelius, or some people say Epictetus. Very few people I've met have said that. So, that's really kind of, it's an interesting place. I mean, I personally love Seneca also as a writer, because I'm a writer myself. And when I read his work, it's very writerly. It's very, the style and the prose always draws me in terms of, you can see his way of thinking, and his way of expressing it is so really quite beautiful. Curious about, what you think of Seneca, maybe as a writer and as someone who pulls you into Stoicism.
There's something about his letters to Lucilius that are just so timeless. They just feel so modern in many ways, and so humane in a way that I don't feel that I personally get from Epictetus or Marcus. Epictetus often feels to me very rigid and strict and almost a bit sort of arrogant. And Marcus Aurelius, at some points, it almost feels a bit navel-gazy, because it's so sort of internalized, and the letters, sort of the meditations to himself. Whereas Seneca is so much about like practical tips for life that he's writing to his friend. And so it just feels so much more accessible to me individually. And for that reason, Seneca's always been my sort of favorite. And really the kind of the Stoicism I feel I align with personally and that I sort of practice probably comes from Seneca more than any other thinkers, really. And some of that's just because I feel like you get an attachment to what your entry point is. And so I've always had that kind of softness for Seneca. But Seneca just feels so messy and in the nitty gritty of life. He's not an emperor soaring over, you know, large armies and all this, you know, political clout that he's got to wield. I mean, Seneca was advising Nero, but this was a very sort of messy, dirty type of activity. It wasn't clean. His ability to get things done was very much frustrated when you're dealing with someone so impetuous and irascible as Nero. And because of that, I just feel like you get something much more humane and relatable, I feel, from
Yeah.
Seneca.
Yeah, it's very relatable, very human and humane. And also, we know that he was flawed. And to me, that kind of helps me relate to him as a person who maybe didn't always do the exact right thing. And as he said, he was crawling after virtue. I'll never forget that phrase because that to me is just very evocative of the human condition.
Yeah, definitely.
I wondered if you could talk about how you've integrated Stoicism or any Stoic processes into your life, if you have done so.
I would say the thing that came to me from the beginning and that still probably factors most into my relationship with Stoicism is expectation setting. I feel like Seneca is really sort of primed on that, where uh, if you're always prepared for the worst to happen, you'll never be disappointed. And I feel I just relate to that so strongly. Whether it's, you know, things in your personal life or even sort of grand political events, global catastrophes, all of this, if you're prepared for the worst, you'll never be disappointed. And I feel like it makes it much easier to deal with things, no matter where they sort of happen in your life. And you can just sort of, things glance over you a bit more and don't frustrate your whole sort of way of being. Sometimes I feel personally I get so hyped up on you know, possibilities, whether you're applying for a job or you're going for a grant or something like this, and you feel like your whole future's riding on this. And Stoicism just sort of reminds you that it's not in your control at the end of the day. You can do your best, but that fortune's always there, and fortune is fickle, and you don't know which way it's going to go. And sometimes the stars will align. The Stoics will say if it's meant to be, you know, nature will sort of direct it in that way, but sometimes it's not. Um, there is this kind of grand cosmic optimism in Stoicism, where everything they sort of believe because of the way God directs all of nature and God is in everything and this grand sort of cosmic reason is imbuing all things and guiding the universe, that everything necessarily always turns out for the best. That's an aspect of Stoicism I actually struggle with sometimes because I feel like uh, I can get a bit wrapped up in that kind of naive optimism sometimes, and it makes it a bit harder to pull back and sort of keep in mind the vicissitudes of fortune. Um, but that's certainly I think of all of Stoicism, that's the thing that I focus on the most. Certainly, um, the whole Epictetus, I feel like also gives you a lot of good tips in the Enchiridion, the manual. You know, foremost the idea of, you know, some things are up to us. You need to focus on what's in your control and not get so concerned with the things you can't control. You can't control what other people are going to think about you. That's something I also wrestle with personally. I get very easily wrapped up in concerns about how other people are judging me, other people concern me. But at the end of the day, it's not in your control. I mean, as a teacher, that's something you're always mindful of because student evaluations are so important for you. And so you have to
Right.
remind yourself at the end of the day, some people just are not going to like you for one reason or another. And you can try your best. You can take the, you know, feedback on board, and you always do. But you always have to have that kind of that mindfulness that at the end of the day, some things are not out of your control, are not in your control, and you need to focus just on what you can do and what you can sort of have power over.
Yeah. Well, going back to one thing that you just shared, which I'm curious about, do you feel that the ancient Stoics really believed in this kind of eternal return of, the world kind of somehow repeats itself over and over again and everything is somehow predefined or preset. What do you think about that?
So I take the Stoics at their word there. That sort of idea of ekporosis. Essentially, the Stoics were one of the first schools to envision a Big Bang. They thought it's a complete cycle that just keeps coming back and back and back. In the beginning, there was this huge fiery conflagration, and everything that exists comes from this fire. And eventually, one day, to everything that will return. And in the meantime, this cosmic mind fire god is directing everything, always necessarily for the best. And I feel like that's something that's sometimes underappreciated about Stoicism is just how much it relies on a very particular theological worldview.
Mm,
If you really want to, follow nature as the Stoics' precept is, the good life is to follow nature. But their idea of nature is this kind of pantheistic God controlling everything in a particular preordained way that's necessarily for the best of the system. And sometimes that means you're going to get kicked in the shins and be thrown in the gutter. And that's because it's serving some greater good that you can't possibly conceive of because you're not seeing the full picture that this cosmic God can. And to be a true Stoic, I think you really do need to buy that premise because
mhm.
otherwise, I don't know how you can sort of get through life without being crushed. I mean, there's that other quote from Seneca where he says, why weep over parts of life when the whole of it calls for tears? And I think if you don't have that kind of cosmic optimism, uh, you will sort of weep over everything. You have to have that view that everything is for the greater good of some grand universal purpose. Otherwise, it's really hard to accept, the terrible things that happen in your personal life.
Yeah.
The heartbreaks, the disease, the loss, the things that we all suffer through, but also the terrible events that we see on the world stage. I mean, Chrysippus, uh, he talks a lot about this idea of theodicy. Right? The Stoics have this theodicy, which is trying to explain why there's evil in the world. Because if God's supposed to be so perfect, why do we see all these bad things happening? And Chrysippus gives a few examples that he picks out. And one of them is a bit banal. He picks cockroaches and says, why are there cockroaches? Well, God's put cockroaches there to remind us to clean our houses. They serve that very sort of neat little purpose. But then the other example he gives is war. And he says, why do all these hundreds of thousands of people have to die these horrible, vicious deaths in warfare? Well, it's for the greater good of the system because there's too many people. You need a bit of population control. And war and famine and plague, they're serving that purpose. And I mean, if you agree with that, it's a very easy out to deal with anything that's happening in the world. But if you don't fully buy into that, I find it rather hard to get to grips with the Stoic sort of attitude towards fate and to going along with nature and to going along with the grand design that reason has deigned for all of us.
Yeah, and where is choice in this? Where's human choice kind of in that picture?
Yeah, and I mean, the Stoics say that we have free will, but free will is limited to those things that are up to us. And so again, I think I'm always going back to Seneca, but I think Seneca has this thing where he says human beings, we're like a dog that's tied to a cart being pulled by the horse. We have free will. The free will is to choose to walk alongside that cart. You can choose to dig your heels in, but then you'll be dragged, and that's a lot less fun. So you always have that choice to go along, to be cheerful and to accept everything that comes. Um, but you can always choose not to. That's just going to be a lot more violent and unhappy for you.
Right, right, right. No, it's a radical way of thinking. I think for people in general and people today. I often also think back to the criticisms, during the Enlightenment, for example, Candide by Voltaire and the whole Pangloss figure of like this the best of all possible. We're living the best of all possible worlds, and everything's for the best. And I find that to be a really compelling critique. I know that's probably a whole other podcast conversation, but I think it's something to think about. I do think modern Stoics, a lot of us, people who are, Stoic inspired today, uh, kind of want to separate from some of that theological worldview. But then it does create maybe some cognitive dissonance there, or at least a challenge, right?
I think it's a lot easier if you belong to certain religious faiths to be a fully committed Stoic, because there are Christian denominations that do believe in this kind, God that's directing all things in particular directions. And in my sort of research, I look at a lot of, 18th, 19th century philosophers who are committed Christians, and they can sort of imbibe that spirit much more easily. And they can just incorporate Stoicism into their worldview. And they sort of develop this kind of deistic, very kind of hippie trippy religion that's still deeply Christian, but they can sort of rationalize it much more easily than I think a lot of the more secular types in our sort of modern age can. I think Epicureanism in some ways is a bit easy to secularize because it very explicitly rejects all the theological. And in that way, it's a bit more sort of easier to imbibe, I think, for some moderns than that deeply, deeply theological aspect of Stoicism.
Yeah, I'd love to hear more about your interest in Epicureanism, the work you've done on that, and then maybe after that, talk a little bit about your book. But maybe you could share how you got into Epicureanism and what you think is interesting there.
Yeah, it was really expediency. I'd spent so much time in Stoicism, and did all this research that ended up becoming this book that I wrote with Lisa Hill, Stoicism in the Western Political Tradition. And I was looking for something to do for my PhD thesis, and I'd sort of felt, to some extent, I'd done Stoicism to death, and that's not true. Um, there's still stuff out there that we can look into and have been looking into. But the low hanging fruit is certainly gone. And, my research on that book I found oftentimes so painful because you're just chasing specters most of the time. Um, so much of the research on the influence of philosophy, because it's so interdisciplinary, there are different sort of evidentiary standards that different folks use. And so a historian is going to be looking for a different thing than a philosopher is, than somebody that's in the English department. Um, and you'll find there are all these sort of echoes of, okay, this person's influenced by Stoicism. And there's these very declarative statements. And you go and read their works, and you're like, well, where is it? Okay, they've talked about virtue a few times. They've talked about the need for self-control. But that's kind of a bit ephemeral. It's not concrete. I want to see them, quoting from Marcus Aurelius, or bringing in a technical concept that really sort of shows that they're engaging with something meaningfully Stoic. Um, and you so much of the time you spend, chasing these specters down rabbit holes, and you just find there's nothing there. There are all these people that are supposedly Stoic, and sometimes it's just the Stoicism is so diffuse because Christianity has adopted a lot of Stoic precepts and moderated a lot of that into their sort of culture. And the other sort of part is, um, in the sort of Renaissance, in the Enlightenment, so much of the education system was based off of learning Latin. And who did you go and read if you're going to learn Latin? You read Cicero. And so Ciceronianism is just so embedded in Western thought in a way that's somewhat underappreciated because a lot of people didn't even sort of study Cicero in any great depth or focus. It was just that's what they were brought up with. It's the same way, we go to, many people go to a Catholic school, and they may not sort of end up being religious, but they're sort of brought up in this sort of strong religious system that sort of influences their thought, whether they're aware of it or not. And Cicero
Right.
kind of is the Catholic school of um, of early modernity and the Renaissance, and just sort of infects everything. And Seneca as well. They were sort of two of the paragons of Latin writing. Cicero was considered like the best, most impressive Latin writer. And so, if you want to learn Latin, you had to read Cicero. And a lot of times, of course, they'd focus on his speeches and his things are less philosophical. But eventually, you get around to his philosophical works, and that kind of stuff just sort of seeps in to the culture. And then you're trying to disentangle, okay, what is specific engagement with Stoicism? What's just this kind of airy fairy Ciceronianisms they sort of picked up? What's just from Christianity? And as I sort of mentioned earlier, I'm always looking for these hard bits of data. And I'd found some of them in my research. And on Stoicism, I ended up focusing a lot on figures like Richard Cumberland, who was a bishop in 17th century England, um, Anthony Ashley Cooper, the third Earl of Shaftesbury, who was a very influential figure in the 18th century, but is almost forgotten today. Basically, everybody read his work back then. And he was uh, deeply and passionately in love with Stoicism. And one of the best things about studying Shaftesbury is, like Marcus Aurelius, he kept a diary. And his diary is just quotes from Marcus Aurelius, quotes from Epictetus, working through the most knotty moral problems of Stoicism and reflecting on them and trying to incorporate that into his own practice, into his own thought. And so you can draw really clear lines from what he's writing in his diary to his other ethical works. And so it's so beautiful as an intellectual historian. He kind of lays it out all for you. Francis Hutcheson, who was a teacher of Adam Smith, is another one that where there's sort of good evidence for, because he did his own translation of Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. And so, very helpfully, he puts in a lot of footnotes where he explains Stoic doctrine in Marcus Aurelius. And you can see the language he uses to explain Stoicism in these footnotes, and then compare them to his ethical works and say, okay, there are direct through lines here as well. And so when you have those kind of gifts, it makes the research very easy. But as I said, like we kind of have mined that. So I had noticed the same sort of problems in the scholarship of Epicureanism as I was struggling with in Stoicism. Lots of broad claims of so-and-so's Epicurean, so-and-so's Epicurean, but very little meat and substance to back them up. So I thought, this looks like ample work, and I can probably make a living out of this, going through and actually seeing where the Epicureanism is. But much like with Stoicism, I found it's chasing ghosts. There are all these grand claims that, I got stuck on Hobbes very early on in my thesis, because more than any other thinker in the Western tradition, Thomas Hobbes gets called an Epicurean, not just by scholars today, but basically all of his peers. Right, this guy's just a terrible Epicurean. And the more I'd sort of try and work out, well, what are they actually saying when they're calling him Epicurean? There was no there. Half the time, they were just using Epicurean as a kind of code word for atheist. And it didn't really even mean atheist. It just meant a non-orthodox Christian, because the Epicureans still believed in God. They were not, out and out atheists as we understand it today. And so that's what would come up most often. Or it would be about the Epicureans have this kind of very egoistic conception of human beings. And that's what Hobbes is tapping into. He's describing human beings as these nasty, brutish creatures. And he's just taken that from Epicureanism. But the more I'd sort of read the Epicurean texts, I really struggled to find that interpretation. Epicurus has this very sort of warm view of humans as these sort of, gregarious creatures that just want friendship and to live in peace in their small little communities. It didn't really sound like Hobbes at all. And so I just got kind of stuck on disentangling all of these threads, tying Hobbes together as a sort of pseudo-Epicurean. And I got to the point of saying, no, there's no actual Epicureanism here. But what I've sort of revealed is there's this whole sort of tradition of the reception of Epicureanism that's not really about Epicureanism. It's about this phantom they've imagined as this evil sort of philosopher that's influencing all the worst thinkers that everybody doesn't
Is
like.
it almost like an insult then? Oh, you Epicurean.
It is. I think it's more or less an epithet. In my thesis, I draw a comparison to, there's an essay that George Orwell wrote in the 1940s about the term fascism. And he says, like, what we call, butchers fascists. We call, people on the left who are dictators fascists. We call people on the right fascists. Anybody we don't like, we call a fascist. And it just loses all sort of meaning as it relates to any particular set of ideologies. And I think that's exactly the same thing that happened with Epicureanism. It gets sort of transmogrified into this sort of slur that you just throw against anybody you don't like. And this is something that sort of Epicureanism has to deal with since antiquity. Even back then, people were calling it out for all these terrible things. Digeus Laertius records all these slurs that were hurled against Epicurus, that, he just overeats all the time, and he vomits twice a day so he can eat even more. He's, always just out cavorting with prostitutes and, drinking to excess and all these things. And, when you disentangle it, well, it looks like Epicurus had some sort of stomach ailment, so he couldn't keep his food down. He had all these sorts of diseases, so that's why he was vomiting. It wasn't to eat more. His diet consisted of, barley and lentils. He writes this letter to his friends saying, if you can send me a pot of cheese, I can live like a king. This is a very sort of moderate idea of pleasure. And all this sort of cavorting with prostitutes is because Epicurus was one of the very few philosophers, like the Stoics, who actually allowed women to his school.
Yes.
most of the women who ended up joining his school actually were prostitutes, because Epicurus uh, didn't discriminate in that way. He was very welcoming. Everybody can join my school. Here, we're just trying to find the happiness of life, and happiness should be open to everyone, no matter what station you come from. And so it was a very sort of radical thing, much like the Bible tells these stories about Jesus, talking about how we should show respect for the tax collector and the prostitute as well. Epicurus is very much in that mold as a sort of radical thinker in that way. But it's very easy to then go, okay, this guy's just a terrible sex pest because he's associating with prostitutes, because we don't want to take him seriously.
Right, right. And it seems that there was a big conflict between Epicureanism and Stoicism in ancient times. Would you say that's accurate? And do you have any sort of thoughts on that?
I tend to think it's much smaller than is usually as usually thought to be. If there was a conflict, it was pretty much one way, because Epicurus sort of was teaching before the Stoics sort of really sort of took off. And so there was no real conflict between Epicurus and Zeno, as far as we can tell. But later thinkers, particularly Chrysippus had it in for Epicurus. So much so, we're told, up until that point in history, Epicurus had written more books than anybody else ever before, something like 300 books. But Chrysippus had to beat that. So he wrote 600 books, so he could double Epicurus's number. He really had it in for him. And there is, evidence that, Chrysippus had particular issues with Epicureanism, but it seems to be one way. We don't really have much in terms of Epicurean material criticizing the Stoics. The Stoics didn't like the Epicureans. But then you have someone like Seneca coming along and saying, look, they're not as different from us as lots of people seem to think. They're actually a much more moderate school than people pretend. And there's a lot of good stuff in here, guys. He's constantly quoting Lucilius he's quoting Epicurus to Lucilius and saying, look, there's lots of good stuff in here that even as a Stoic you can take as well. And it's not as different as most people seem to think it is.
I think that listeners should think about when they consider, here are the good things about Epicureanism. Like, what would you recommend to people to consider? Can they weave this in somehow to their own personal life philosophy? Because now in the book that I co-authored, we did have a chapter on Epicureanism, and sort of the point of our book is that you can learn from all these different schools of ancient Greek and Roman thought, and potentially even consider weaving in bits and pieces and curating, some of your own life philosophy. So I'd be really curious, if most of our listeners are into Stoicism, what could we learn from Epicureanism?
Yeah, I fully agree with you on that point of the sort of eclecticism. I tend to think of myself as a bit of a philosopher pirate. I just sort of sail the seas and I steal whatever is good. I mean, again, I just keep coming back to Seneca. When he keeps sort of quoting Epicurus to Lucilius, Lucilius says to him, like, why are you going off into enemy territory? We've got enough good stuff here. Seneca retorts, whatever is true is mine. And I think that sort of, I feel that so strongly in my own life. Whatever is true is mine. So I take from the Stoics, I take from the Epicureans. The Epicureans, I think the most important thing they give us is it's okay to want to be happy. The Stoics sort of, they throw off that quest for happiness. And they say, no, you want to be virtuous. And if you're virtuous, happiness will necessarily come as a consequence, but you're not allowed to focus on the happiness. You have to focus on the virtue. And Epicurus says, let's just cut the crap. Like, we know what we want. We want to be happy. And let's just not sort of obfuscate that with all these other pretended goals. That's what we want. And if we're going to be virtuous, it's only because it's going to make us happy. But Epicurus's idea of happiness or pleasure is a lot more restricted than the popular conception. So I think hedonism tends to get sort of conflated with an earlier version that was professed by the Cyrenaics. They were kind of the precursors to Epicureanism. And the Cyrenaics are very clear. Okay, all we want is pleasure, but we want particular pleasures. You want whatever physical pleasures you can get in a moment. And that may be, indulging in food, alcohol, sex. But Epicurus takes a different view. For him, there are both physical and mental pleasures, which the Cyrenaics deny, but then there are also both static and kinetic pleasures. So the hierarchy between physical and mental pleasures is also quite important for the Epicureans, because they say it's the mental pleasures that matter so much more than the physical pleasures. And by the same token, it's mental pains that are so much more important than physical pains. I mean, you break an arm, you get a bruise, these things, they don't last very long. But mental pains can torment you for life. You can get caught in these recurrent loops where you're just stewing on the same thing that you did 6 years ago. And I really shouldn't have said that. And it just haunts you, and you can't get out of this loop. So Epicurus says that's what you got to focus on more than anything else. You need to focus on alleviating these mental stresses, and you can do that by following our procedures. And that's also where he gets in this division between static and kinetic pleasures. So kinetic pleasures are what we normally consider pleasure. It's a pleasure of movement. So when you are drinking a glass of wine, or you're having a nice plate of pasta, the pleasures in that moment as things are sort of changing, that's a kinetic pleasure. That's the sort of physical pleasures that we usually understand. But Epicurus says catastematic or static pleasures are actually what's most important. And these are the pleasures that you get when you don't have a longing. It's an absence of craving in your life. And so the top two catastematic pleasures, so that the mental ones are known as ataraxia, which the Stoics also talk about, and the physical ones are known as aponia, which is a lack of pain, a lack of toil. And there's in that sort of sense, I think Epicureanism relates to Stoicism much more than people think, because it's all about attaining this sort of state of mental tranquility. So you can go about your life with happiness and not being bothered by all the terrible things that are going on around you. But I think that sort of hierarchy where you're focusing on mental pleasures is so important, because Epicurus would tell us things that, friends are so important because they guarantee you this kind of mental happiness. So you think, you go out with your friends, you have a nice night out, you might go for dinner, you might have a few drinks, you have a great chat. Those are also kinetic pleasures. But you get these mental pleasures as well from them, the anticipation of, okay, I'm really looking forward to this night out. You have the memories that carry on. And so the memories of good times are really, really important for an Epicurean as well. On his deathbed, Epicurus writes his letter to Idomeneus, one of his followers, and says, although I'm dying of, I think, kidney stones or whatever the terrible ailments he has, I am kept happy by the memory of our great conversations. That's enough to sort of carry me over the physical pains. And that's something I think that a Stoic can sort of incorporate. That idea that, if we focus on these sort of mental pleasures, whether they be the pleasures of that ataraxia of trying to keep calm and tranquil, not being stressed and anxious about all the terrible things that are going on around us, but also just we don't need to throw out the kinetic pleasures as well. We don't need to throw out that enjoyment, because that's what really carries you through life. When you're on your deathbed, you're not going to be sitting and thinking about how virtuous and wise and courageous you are. You're going to be thinking about the great memories, the moments you shared throughout your life with the people that really matter. And I think Epicurus is just so much more humane on that front than the Stoics are.
Mm, that's super interesting, and I think that this delineation of the different types of pleasures is important. And yeah, I'd love the answer of, how can we stop thinking about that thing we said or did 6 years ago? How do we do that? There's some good advice Epicurean can give us, and Epicurus could tell me.
Yeah, so again, I think you need to remember what's in our control. The Epicureans is a different term, but it's essentially that same thing. And our attitudes and responses to world events are always in our control. How you can stop sort of ruminating on past events. I mean, Epicurus is primarily concerned with there's a sort of a hierarchy of the worst sort of fears and anxieties. For him, number one is the fear and anxieties of the gods. There's a Epicureanism distills its teachings into what is known as a tetrapharmakos, which translates as fourfold drug. It's very sort of pharmaceutical or therapeutic in that respect. And the rule number one is don't worry about God. So that sort of gives you a sense of where that sits in the hierarchy. Rule number two is don't worry about death. That's the second one. Number three is what is good is easy to get, because Epicurus says, the best pleasures are very simple. Like friends are pretty easy to get, and they're going to give you more happiness than most things. We get pleasures from eating food, but a bit of cheese and some nice bread is going to make you just as happy as that $150 steak that you get from your best restaurant. the duration of these pleasures is so small that in the right circumstance, you'll get more pleasure out of that cheese. Just think about it. If you are going to go have dinner with your friends and you are going to a very fancy restaurant, but you've had a bit of a crap day, you're very stressed, you're very anxious, you're just not in the mood for it. You're going to go there. You might sort of unwind a bit after your glass of wine, but you're just not going to be feeling it. And you sort of feel like, God, I just wish I had a better day before I went out. I just feel like I've wasted this, all this money, this great meal, and I just really wasn't into it. But on the flip side, if you've had a great day, things have been going well for you, you're in a really good mood, and you go to a little bit of a dive bar, and you just have, some crappy bar snacks and a few drinks, and you're with your friends, and you're just like, you're really happy, and like, I'm really grateful and lucky to have these people in my life. And you'll feel so much pleasure in that moment than you will, stressing over the fact that you're not enjoying that $150 steak. So what is good is easy to get. And he also says, what is bad is easy to endure. He says there's two options. Either it's really bad and really painful, in which case it won't last long because you're probably going to die soon. So don't worry about it so much. On the flip side, if it's not so bad, if it's going to last, chronic pains, they tend to be not as severe, and you can, dull them with, medicine if you need, but they're endurable. There's nothing that you can't sort of surmount. So fear of death, I think of those, does account for a large gamut of what Epicurus worries about. Fear of gods, it's easy to dismiss in modernity, but I think fear of death is something that plagues us more than we think. And Epicurus says, we see fear of death emanating in so much of the longing people have in their lives as they struggle for, wealth, for fame, for power. This is really just a repudiation of the fact that we're going to die. Why do you want to be president? You want to be president so your name will be etched in stone in all the history books and your name will never be forgotten. Why do you want to be rich and powerful so you can build monuments to yourself so you'll never be forgotten? It's all just this sort of inherent fear of death. And Epicurus says, the whole universe, it's all just atoms and void. That's all it is. And everything that exists is just a combination of atoms in different orders. And so the soul too, it's just atoms spread through our body. And as these atoms came together when we were born to create a human being, so they will disperse when we die. And that's it. There's nothing more. There's no lingering afterlife. There's nothing to worry about with heaven or hell. There's the atoms will collapse and that's it. You go back into nothingness. Death, Epicurus says, is just like the tens of millions of years before you were born. There was nothingness then, and to nothingness you will return. So don't worry about it. And you cannot control the future. The future is not in your grasp. So if you focus on those easy things that you can get in this life, on your friends, on your community, on these simple pleasures, on living easy, on not stressing about, the distant future and how you'll be remembered, or your wealth or power or prestige, you can live a very simple, happy life and be free from all of these stresses that plague our society. Epicurus makes this point. In history, like before we had kings and gold and property and all these things, nobody stressed about them. We were very happy back in prehistory, living on the savannah, eating some berries, kicking around with some friends by a river, singing songs. It was wonderful. But now we stress about all these things we just don't need. They're all human inventions. And society has acculturated us to want these things that can never make us happy. They're very good at propelling society along. You need people who want power, to want prestige, to want to be kings, to want property. Otherwise, you're not going to have a society at all. But leave them alone to it, because we know it's not going to make them happy. Lucretius compares the striving for power in politics to Sisyphus. He says, running in elections, you're just pushing that stone up the hill and it's going to come back down. You cannot keep everybody on side. You cannot keep this power. It's not in your control. And you're just like that, Sisyphus pushing the rock. You're never going to get to the top. You're never going to get what you want. And there's just so much pain and stress in the meantime. So just forget about it. You don't need it. Leave it to the others who feel like they do need it, the deluded few. And just focus on the simple things that can really make you happy, because they're guaranteed. Enough food, enough water, some friends. that locks it in. There's no risk there. If you've got yourself a little community that's self-sufficient, uh, Epicurus says if you've got enough food, water, shelter, and friends, and you can be sure of having them, you're going to contend with Zeus for happiness. It's that sort of surety of knowing you're secure, you're safe, and you have nothing to worry about. That's pure bliss, and that you'll be vying with the gods for happiness if you have that.
Yeah, I think that's very well said. What would you say to the common criticism of Epicureanism that, it's about a withdrawal from the world and there's all these problems out there, but we're not really responsible for fixing them or dealing with them? I'm just curious, you explained it so eloquently. What would you say to that?
So part of the answer is Epicurus says you have to respect, it's not follow nature writ large for Epicureanism, it's follow your nature. And we do have different natures. So Epicurus makes it clear there are some people who are just going to be dispositionally drawn to getting involved. There are some people who can't be happy unless they get involved in politics. And it's wrong for them to spurn their nature. They need to do what they need to do. And if that means getting involved, then they should. But Epicureanism, on the other hand, there's a broader prescription as well that you can only do the Epicurean lifestyle, you can only do the withdrawal so long as the circumstances allow it. So it is dependent on living in a society flourishing enough to allow enough room for some people to withdraw. If your circumstances cannot guarantee that security, then you need to get involved to make enough space for that security. So it's not an absolute. Um, it is dependent on you having the circumstances around you that allow you that choice. And if you don't, you have to do what's necessary. For the Epicureans, the number one virtue and the only one they're really concerned about is prudence. You need to exercise prudence in every single choice you make through your life. And you need to choose the things that are going to guarantee you the greatest amount of happiness in the long run. And sometimes that will mean doing things that are painful. Sometimes, we have to undertake laborious exercise, go to the gym, take up running. These things are often very unpleasant in the beginning and can continue to be unpleasant even as you get more expertise. But you do it because in the long run, guaranteeing your health will bring you much more happiness than living, lazily and in sloth now, but being very unfit and unhealthy in the years to come and not being able to enjoy your life. And in the same respect, when the Epicureans talk about ataraxia and aponia, aponia is usually translated as freedom from pain. But in my work, I sort of argue there's a bit more to aponia because in Greek, pain is actually algos. So, we have a term for freedom from pain in English. It's analgesic. It's the absence of algos. Ponos is something different. And if you go to Greek mythology, Ponos sort of refers to, it's a sort of personification of work and labor and toil. And so I think the Epicureans are getting at something slightly broader there and usually sort of free from the sort of the real sort of drudgery of work. But the Epicureans also say sometimes you're going to have to get involved to guarantee yourself some happiness. And that might be, working a farm. Diogenes of Oinoanda describes the Epicurean golden age. And a lot of people think that for an Epicurean to live happily, they're going to have some slaves to do all the work for them so they can just sit in this kind of withdrawal. But Diogenes of Oinoanda talks about the Epicurean golden age when everyone is an Epicurean sage. And he says, in this time, of course, there'll be no slaves. So we're going to have to go and dig our own trenches, build our own sort of canals and waterways, and sow our own seeds and grow our own food. And that's okay. You can sort of go and struggle in the world sometimes because it guarantees you this greater happiness in the long run. You just have to use your prudence in knowing the right choices to make that are going to guarantee you that long run happiness. Yeah.
Back to Stoicism for a moment. I wonder if there's anything else you'd like to share about your book, Stoicism and the Western Political Tradition. I mean, are there any sort of key themes that stood out to you or anything that really surprised you as you worked on it? Especially because I know there are a lot of people who, they read about Stoicism, they listen to podcasts, but there's still a lot of things we're also trying to understand about Stoicism. And a lot of those Greek sources are gone, right? And so what even is Stoicism? Like we have to kind of make sure that we define it. So anyway, I'd just love you to share a little bit more about the themes of your book and what you found.
So our book is very much focused on the reception of Epicureanism in early modernity and the on Stoicism in early modernity and the Enlightenment. And so I'd say the things that sort of surprised me, or in that sort of sense, were more on that reception side than in the nitty gritty of Stoicism itself. Um, I don't think there's much in sort of Stoic theory itself. I mean, I guess it's not so much a surprise, but it often astounds me just how murky our understanding still is today. And you're often just dealing with contradictory evidence. That's always the case. And you'll find there's such a consensus position about the Stoics being one thing. And then when you start to read the text, you just find so much evidence that expresses the exact opposite view. And there's so much that's messy and contradictory in Stoicism. And as a historian, like that's the kind of thing that I'm very comfortable sitting in that messiness and contradiction, which I don't think philosophers always are. Particularly Epicureanism, they're always very keen to extrapolate from certain principles, entire sort of doctrine. Epicureans say pleasure is the greatest good, so it must mean that we don't really like our friends because it just means the end of pleasure, which is completely wrong if you look at what Epicurus says. He says every friend is worth choosing for their own sake, which goes against that kind of expediency view. He said the same thing in Stoicism as well. But sort of in terms of the uptake and its reception, I'd say one of the interesting things, I was sort of touching on this before, is just how much it is a story of Seneca and Cicero for such a long time. Um, it's not really until the 18th century that Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius get a fair hearing. I mean, Epictetus is the last major Stoic work to be translated into English. They got the Enchiridion for a while, but it's fairly late in the 18th century that we finally get an English translation of the Discourses. So that comes around rather late. And although Marcus Aurelius is available by the 16th century, they don't read him for about 150 years. Part of the thinking is the first major edition done by a fellow called Xylander. He gave it a sort of a name sort of like to himself. It wasn't until later those called Meditations. And so they kind of just thought it was a diary and not anything of philosophical interest. So because of that, the early sort of views of Stoicism get sort of so um, encrusted with that kind of Roman, Latin, Cicero, and Seneca kind of imprint on it. And it takes a while to sort of shake that off and get the kind of different perspectives that Marcus and Epictetus bring in. And although I was sort of touching on this earlier about how simpatico Stoicism can be with Christianity, I guess one of the things that surprised me was just how much hostility there is in a lot of the Christian tradition to Stoicism. They always accused Stoicism of the sin of pride. And if you know the seven deadly sins, pride was considered the worst of all the sins. And they thought the Stoics were full of pride because of their emphasis on human rationality. The Stoics believe that through human reason, we can control ourselves, we can control our happiness, control our virtue. And there are a lot of Christians who said this is a really extreme form of pride, particularly those Christians that were sort of more aligned with the Augustinian tradition that see humans as fundamentally fallen beings. They would always argue that there's no way to be virtuous or to be a good person without turning your heart to God, because we are these wicked, fallen creatures. We are necessarily degenerate unless God bestows his grace onto us. And because of that, the Stoics, they're just so arrogant. They think that we have this in our power, that we can just think our way out of this with no divine intercession. And this is just such a horrible view to have. And I think that sometimes gets lost in the reception of Stoicism now, particularly amongst sort of lay folks. There's a deep sort of Christian suspicion at the same time to that idea that you can do it yourself, that all you need is your own sort of rationality. You don't need to surrender to a higher being to realize your self-control, your self-mastery, your virtue, your wisdom, all of these things.
It's fascinating, especially because of what you shared earlier about the Stoic sort of theology that was at the core of what the ancient Stoic emphasized. That's really interesting about the pride aspect, which I wasn't as familiar with. I know there was some hostility, but I didn't quite realize
Mm.
that rationality led to this idea of pride. And I could sort of see what you're getting at. I'll have to do a little bit more reading on that. And while we're talking about your work in political philosophy and intellectual history, I know that you work with students, and I know you're also teaching a course called The History of Greed. It sounds really interesting. I wondered if you'd share a little bit about what it's like to teach students these days, what you're hoping to share with them, and kind of maybe touch on that class a little.
It's interesting because I've been teaching this class for about 10 years now, and I've seen the generational shifts, particularly sort of pre and post COVID. I think I came in on the tail end of what was still largely the millennial generation, and then it sort of transitioned further into Gen Z. There's kind of like three distinct cohorts, and politically they've changed a lot. They've also changed in terms of engagement. I find there's a lot to spare about the post-COVID generation, but I found them to be um, a lot more engaged in some ways. I think perhaps because they experienced the isolation of being locked in their homes and away from people for so long. Um, they tend to be so much keener to actually be there in person. And I see so much more engagement from them sometimes. They actually do the readings and they take interest in these things. Uh, it's interesting teaching Stoicism and Epicureanism in the context of a politics department, because political theory, I think a lot of politics departments, but especially ours, tends to be kind of glossed over these days. It's so dominated now by international relations, security, terrorism, these sorts of things. And so the students are sometimes in for a shock when they take our courses because these are things they've never been exposed to before. And so it's one thing to introduce them to, Thomas Hobbes or John Stuart Mill or John Locke, which is alien enough to them. But then you throw in the curveball, the Stoics and the Epicureans, and I find it perhaps the most polarizing topic that we teach, because some students they get switched on fire by it, like they just love it. It's something so new and interesting to them, and they really take to it, and it's so heartening to see. But there's always another sort of side to it where some students just find it so alien to everything they've done so far at university. And
Yeah.
some of them, they're not even doing politics degrees. They're choosing this as an elective. Now they're
Wow.
coming from computer science or from biology or economics. And to sort of come into a class, and this is one of the first topics we do, we're talking about Stoicism and Epicureanism. It really sort of can alienate them sometimes. This is not what I thought a politics course was supposed to be about. This is, hardcore ancient philosophy.
Injecting philosophy into my politics course.
Yeah, and so they either love it or they hate it. Um, and it's very sort of polarizing in that respect.
But it is
But
very
I've
optimistic to hear that you have Gen Z students who are really engaged and who are really. I mean, I have two Gen Z kids, and they are very engaged and they love learning, and they're always asking questions and thinking and trying to discover new things in general. But kind of the maybe the stereotype you hear is a lot of students who aren't doing that. So I always think I'm optimistic, but it's good to hear from your perspective that you are seeing engagement and interest, even if some people get a little annoyed at like, oh, philosophy, because of course also students think of philosophy as this esoteric thing that is not relevant to life because it's too academic or ivory tower. So it's, kudos to you for like bringing it down to earth for people as well.
Yeah, I don't know if it's sort of culture specific, because I hear so much, particularly in American colleges, about how sort of much trouble they're having with the current generation. But from my perspective, I found the real nadir in student engagement to be around 2018, 2019. Um, that generation, that pre-COVID generation, they would not come to class. I remember giving lectures, and there's one person in the room. It was very, very lonely. Um, and it's not like you have full lecture halls now, but it's so much better than it was before. You've got dozens of bodies that actually talk to and ask questions, and they ask you questions back, and it's so much more rewarding in that respect. It may also be we've had sort of reforms to our university system that went in around 2020 that meant that student fees went up dramatically. And so I think there's also amongst some students a bit more of a sense of we need to get our money's worth and actually get what we're paying for in that respect. But no, I've been really impressed. I always ask my students when we start the component on Stoicism and Epicureanism, how many of you have heard about Stoicism before? How many of you have heard about Epicureanism before? And look, to be honest, usually Epicureanism, I might get one hand if I'm lucky. That's usually something not many people have heard of. But the number of students that have heard about Stoicism has been going up progressively year after year after year. And so it was maybe nearly a third to a half that already had some familiarity with Stoicism going in to the last class I taught. So it is sort of seeping through. It's kind of interesting because on the academic side, I've always been kind of divorced from the more popular modern sort of Stoicism that's been going on in the background. But I've sort of seen the peaks and troughs that's sort of gone through over the past decade. I sort of keep my eye on it. But we don't sort of engage with that as much because we're sort of so locked in the world of academia where it's a different kind of audience, it's a different kind of publishing world that you're focusing on. So you're not always as clued into that. But uh, there has been a sort of a change of relationship with Stoicism that I've seen amongst the public, and I feel like it's getting a bit closer to something that's a bit more respectful to the original tradition. I sort of feel the popular Stoicism when I first started was this kind of tech bro Stoicism of Silicon Valley, and it was very much this kind of you need to it was a hyper masculinized kind of involved with that kind of growth and self-control mindset, and it's kind of become a bit more authentic. I've seen, at least in what my students are engaging with. Perhaps it's the rise of different sort of social media platforms, but I'm finding students are coming with a better and more accurate and a more respectful attitude towards Stoicism. They used to be a bit put off, some of them, by that kind of
Yeah, kind of the
influence of
Broicism
Stoicism. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That's really interesting. Yeah, I find that now more and more, past couple years when I talk to random folks I meet, a bartender, a person on a hike, people you wouldn't expect, but they're quite familiar with Stoicism
Mm.
as at least what they see online. That a lot of them have read a book somewhere along the way. And maybe these are just the people I happen to talk to, but I think more and more people seem to be exposed to it, and that excites me a lot. And then that's also part of the reason why my co-authors and I decided to write about other schools of Greek and Roman philosophy, because we felt like much like you do with Epicureanism, that if we don't understand those, we're also missing something really critical about kind of the history of Western thought and the ideas that could help us gain perspective on today. So even if you don't really study history, to study some of those key ideas from those philosophies that have really shaped maybe the Western way of thinking, I think is super valuable. So that's why I keep talking to people about it. And just, this is one of those conversations. I guess to kind of wrap us up, I wondered if you would share a little bit more about, advice you give to people who are thinking about practical applications of philosophy and thinking about the meaning that it brings. And also connecting it to, kind of your own sense of meaning in your life, if you feel that it has given you meaning. Would love to hear about that.
Yeah, I feel like, I mean, that's the question at the end of the day, isn't it? I mean, that's what draws me to these ancient philosophies, because to me, the most important question in life is, what's the point of it? What is the good life? And the Hellenistic schools, more than any others that I've ever studied, put that at the forefront. You can sort of derive an answer to the good life from many of the other schools, but the Stoics and Epicureans, they pinpoint that as the main sort of goal that everything sort of drives towards. And I think that's why they're sort of so relevant still to our sort of way of approaching the world today, because it's very hard to find secular sources for that kind of deep spiritual longing. I mean, and Nietzsche wrote over 100 years ago now that God is dead, and now man is sort of stumbling through life without an anchored sense of meaning. And we don't really have good touch points in our culture to give people the answers they want. that aren't religion. And we are sort of seeing resurgences of people turning to religion, but I think that also is what's driving the sort of turn, particularly to Stoicism. Because I think Stoicism, the texts that we have, are just sort of so approachable in giving you that sense of meaning. Marcus Aurelius, I think, just becomes really sort of popular for that particular reason. It's sort of so accessible, and it's so rooted in that longing for meaning and that attachment to this grand sense of um, belonging and reason and a way of being. You have to work a bit harder the Epicureans to get to get a real sense of what you need to do from them. The texts that we have of theirs are so much more scattered and fragmentary. For the Epicureans, you really just have his letters and a list of sayings that Digeus Laertius has preserved, and then you have Lucretius's De Rerum Natura, which is this epic poem. And that gives you some sense of Epicurean physics and the atoms controlling everything. And if you're worried about, God intervening and throwing a lightning bolt at you, it gives you all the reasons why you don't need to worry about that. But it's not as accessible to us anymore today. Whereas the Stoics, there's just something so timeless in whether it's Epictetus's discourses, Marcus's meditations, Seneca's letters, or his essays. They are approaching something so fundamentally human about how to deal with the vicissitudes of life, how to find meaning, how to find happiness, how to find a sense of purpose. The Stoics just, they hand it to you on a silver platter that makes it really sort of easy to slot that in and get the answers that I think a lot of people are looking for. But as we've been sort of talking about in this discussion, the Stoic answers are so rooted in a particular place and time and theological viewpoint that it's hard to sort of take it on board and assimilate it fully. I don't really think it is possible to be a modern Stoic in the full sense of the word, because you have to make so many choices about and assumptions about the way that the world works that I think just is so fundamentally pre-modern. I think at the end of the day, you just kind of have to, as a modern searcher, be happy and find comfort in the unease of the not knowing, because there aren't answers. It's the asking that matters. There's a thing from, I think it might be Chrysippus, one of the Stoics, where he's sort of talking about the telos, the goal of life of Stoicism. Because the whole point is to be a wise man, right? It's to be the sage, this wise person. But how many Stoic sages were there in history? They can sort of rattle off a few on one hand. I mean, maybe Socrates, Zeno, of course, maybe Chrysippus. Seneca thinks Cato was a sage, but they can't get beyond, 5 or 6. And so if the whole point of this philosophy is to become this wise person who's imperturbable and in this state of bliss, it's a bit rich to have this grand goal that nobody seems to ever be able to do. I mean, nobody claims that Seneca or Epictetus actually got to that point. It's a very rarefied sort of state. But one of the Stoics, and I think it might have been Chrysippus, said you can think about philosophy as archery, and you have this target. And the point of it is you're not always going to hit the bullseye, but the point is the trying. You're going to miss. If you get it on the board, great, but chances are you're not going to hit the bullseye. You have to train a heck of a lot to get that good with archery until you can hit the bullseye. But the point of it is the striving. The point of it is to try. The point of it is the exercise. It's to get involved. It's to have a go. And I think that's something helpful to bear in mind, because we can't be a Stoic sage. I think maybe the Christians are a bit right about the idea of pride. Human beings are just sort of too fallible. Our reason is not that powerful. I'm not so sure we can reach these grand, lofty states that the Stoics hope for us. I think we're just sort of too broken and weak-willed, and just the human constitution is not as godlike as they'd like to hope for us. But we can try. And
I mean, Fourth Archer can help us see a way of really trying without being attached to the outcomes having to be one specific way. I think that to me is a really powerful idea.
yeah, I don't think you need to stress about the absolutes. If you can get 1% of the way, you're 1% happier. If you get 2%, you're 2% happier. You can take these sort of small steps and you can, get 2% happier in your life from what you take from Stoicism, maybe another 1 or 2 from Epicureanism. These small things can make a big difference in the course of your life. You can just take a few hints and tips for life, wherever you can find them, and incorporate them into your life practice. And if you can sort of stress less about 1 or 2 extra things in your life from each of these traditions, that will put you in good stead. You're not going to be able to cure everything that ails you, but maybe you can, deal with some of the more chronic issues, perhaps.
I love that, Eden. That's a really well-stated view that I hope to live by myself. Sometimes it's very aspirational, but it's always worth trying. And I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you for joining me.
It's been a blast.